Hello and welcome to my life, which was advertised as being primarily about my work in broadcasting, and it mostly will be, but we need a bit of context. You see, I think I've been quite lucky with the opportunities I've been given in life. But if you looked me up on the internet, you won't actually have found much about me, in part, at least, thanks to my actor namesake. You see, I chose to tread quite softly in my chosen field, working mainly in radio, with latterly only occasional TV. And as I like to say, a lot of my life has been spent hiding in plain sight behind the microphone. I'll come back to that later. But in the meantime, let's start at the very beginning, which, as the song tells us, is a very good place to start. I was born in Edinburgh, and for reasons best known to my parents, I went to George Watson's Boys' College, as it was then known. I didn't particularly enjoy it there. I was never a star pupil, mainly because I had very little interest in sport. However, I did get good enough hires to get me here, to Aberdeen University, where I planned to study law, mainly because I was idealistic about justice, something which was stamped out of it very quickly in the first term. I also realised, thanks to classes in conveyancing and tax law, that it could all probably really be quite dull and boring, and my apologies to any lawyers who happen to be in the audience. But at the time, Aberdeen University allowed me to end up with a joint degree in law and economics, something that was going to be extremely beneficial after I graduated. My parents were undoubtedly very proud of me on graduation day and fully expected me to go and get a job with a law firm somewhere or possibly join a local authority. One of my father's school friends was town clerk for Perth Council. So it came as a considerable surprise to them when I disappeared, took a train down to London, and came back to announce that I had joined this organisation, the CBI. It had only just been formed about 18 months before, so everything felt really quite new. It was also a time when the form of government was known as tripartitism. In other words, legislation was formed as the collective act between employers, trade unions and the government. My job there was to work on what was to become this document, the Health and Safety at Work Act. I joined a team of 3 working on it, and one of the things we had to do was to travel around the country visiting the various CBI regions to speak to members and gather their opinions on what they thought of this new law. And after it became law, we started running around the country again, this time accompanied by people from the TUC and government to explain what had been enacted. Clear? Anyway, towards the end of this period, a unique job opportunity came up. The official title was Personal Assistant to the Director General, and so for the following 2 years I followed this man, Campbell Adamson, delightful chap born in Perth, to virtually all of his meetings, including with MPs, ministers and even the Prime Minister then, Harold Wilson. I was there to take notes of what happened as a record. My main other task was to be his speechwriter, or rather to be his speech coordinator, listening with various departments to agree what he should say at various events. That's where the economics actually came in quite useful. However, there are 2 specific days that stand out from this time. The first involved this lady, Margaret Thatcher. She came in to sound out the CBI about her plan to stand for the leadership of the Conservative Party. She was in for maybe, 3/4 of an hour, and when she left, Campbell summed it up along the following lines: very bright, very passionate, but leader of the Tories? Never. He left to join Abbey National just before she was elected, so never had to eat his words. Then there was this man. Some of you may know him, Sir David Stirling, founder of the SES. Clearly he didn't come in uniform, but he certainly had military thoughts in mind. Because he was a well-respected character, the red carpet had been put out for him, but after a few minutes he asked to have a word alone with just Campbell Adamson himself and his deputy. Everyone else trooped out. But a few minutes later we could hear raised voices and the sound of David Stirling being escorted from the building. We asked what had happened and were told, my God, he wanted our support for a military coup against the Labour government. I don't know if that changes anyone's opinions about the man. After all, he was a war hero, but he certainly lost a few friends by what he proposed on that day. I spent about 6 years with the CBI before proving that Dr. Johnson was not entirely right. You can tire of London, but not tire of life. It was the time of the first referendum on devolution, the one that failed, and I fancied still being part of this new Scotland. So I ended up here at the Scottish NFU. I shall say no more other than to mention that my job involved pigs and horticulture, part of which came back to haunt me in the next stage of my life. Now, you may be wondering what all this has to do with broadcasting. Well, I started scouring the papers again, and there were 2 job ads on the same day. One for the old SDA, now Scottish Enterprise, and the other for BBC Scotland. By the time the SDA had acknowledged my application, I had been interviewed, screen tested and given the job by BBC Scotland, and in particular this programme, Current Account, a twice-weekly documentary series. Well, those were the days when BBC Scotland could afford to do things like that. Anyway, I also suspect some of you are wondering how someone with my experience could end up working for the telly. Well, let's go back to Aberdeen University. This is the Taylor building, and yes, I did have a few lectures here, but more important, it was the home of the University Television Service, the studio which looked a bit like this at the time. Indeed, this is the original Granada news studio, and Aberdeen was given the kit when they moved to colour. They allowed students to make programmes, so I spent time in front of and behind the camera and interviewed visiting academics and assorted celebs. So, unlike other candidates, I was perfectly comfortable sitting in the BBC studio for the screen test. And the man who'd run the TV service in Aberdeen, he'd run Tomorrow's World until he burned out, told me, don't go straight into the media, make yourself interesting first. That time with Campbell Adamson made me interesting enough. Anyway, back to the BBC. At that time, this man, Magnus Magnuson, was the main presenter of Current Account. He was exactly what you would imagine. Everyone's favourite uncle, friendly, helpful, supportive. And then later, we were joined by this man, George Reid. He'd been one of the SNP MPs from 74 to 79. I got to know some of the SNP cohort while in London, but I can't really remember if that included George. We never really did hit it off. Now, remember that I said my time with the NFU might come to haunt me. Well, a producer decided that we needed to make a film about the Danish pig industry for some reason. And I'd been the pigs expert from the NFU, so we flew across to Copenhagen and had quite a successful trip, apart from one thing. You see this man? He's a pig farmer holding a piglet. That's what the producer wanted me to do for a piece to camera. Now, the farmer is appropriately dressed. He knows how to handle a baby pig. You know what happened? The baby pig did what piglets do, and I was able to claim a pair of new trousers on expenses. After a couple of seasons, I decided I had to learn this craft properly, so I went to join the Radio Scotland newsroom in Edinburgh, then based at 5 Queen Street. There's not much to say about this period other than to point out that with Current Account, each team made one film every 3 weeks. At Radio Scotland, I probably produced 3 different audio reports in one day. After about 18 months, an opportunity came up at STV, which looked quite interesting, the job of industrial correspondent, which I got. But the 1980s were a rather depressing time to be such a reporter. Almost every week we would head for one of the threatened steelworks, or the threatened shipyards, or the threatened coal mines. And I was always a little uncomfortable in STV, in part because of the egos, the personalities even behind the scenes, which were much bigger than those at the Beeb, and in part because of the way I'd been trained by a couple of really good editors at Radio Scotland. Their advice: you should never be the story, you're there to help other people tell theirs. That's why I said I hid behind the microphone in plain sight. But just one little tale from that time. The main presenter of Scotland Today was John Toy. One day he'd been invited to speak at a business lunch and had been rather too royally entertained to be able to present the show. "Where's Jim White?" they asked. Jim was quite fond of topping up his tan, but on that particular day he'd fallen asleep while on the sunbed and was the colour of a cooked lobster. In stepped Nick Radcliffe to save the day. Jim, as you may know, went on to have a highly successful career with Sky Sports. He retired earlier this year. John and Nick are sadly no longer with us. After a year, I just had to move on and joined the team of reporters who worked with Good Morning Scotland, but this time in what the BBC described as a freelance staff contract. Although that sounds a contradiction in terms, it's quite a good gig to be on. You started work at about 3 p.m. and finished when you presented a completed 3 to 3.5 minute feature for the following morning. It meant you had the rest of the day to do other things, like writing for Scottish Business Insider magazine, for example. But I was getting restless again, mainly because my marriage at that time was falling apart, so I headed back south and joined the Money programme. It was presented at that time by these two people, Brian Woodlake, who joined after presenting The World at 1pm, and Val Singleton, who was previously famous for Blue Peter. This was a stunningly well-funded programme. I think it was about £120,000 an episode. They thought nothing of sending a reporter and crew on Concorde across to New York for a single interview and then come home on the return flight. Gone are those days. Finally, a word about Val Singleton. If you look her up on Wikipedia, it says that her partner is Eddie Mair, former presenter of PM, Good Morning Scotland before that, now with LBC. This apparently started as a joke. One 29th of February, Val decided to ask Eddie to marry her, live on air. I first met Eddie 40 years ago. He's been with his partner Paul for many years. After a season with the Money programme, the editor who appointed me accepted a promotion, and his replacement wanted, if not a clean sweep, then a change in personnel, and I took that as my cue to head back north. This time it was a much better mix awaiting me. I was no longer just working for news and current affairs. But from now on I was working pretty much exclusively for radio. Yes, they say you get better pictures there anyway. So I presented a series of science programmes, for example. I also produced natural history programmes, and then there were the festivals. In Scotland, in normal times, there isn't a month when there isn't a festival of one kind, from Edinburgh's Hogmanay to a children's festival to the science festival, and then there's that monster that Edinburgh's summer festivals have become. For about 5 years they dominated my life, but if I were to pick one single show that stands out, it has to be Macbeth on Inchcombe. This is the poster for it, and it sort of captures the atmosphere. But approaching the island on the Maid of the Forth at dusk and seeing 10th century soldiers holding flaming torches aloft and the chanting of monks, and as you got really close, the appearance of the witches on the boat itself was breathtaking.
When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won,
that will be ere the set of sun.
Where the place?
Upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth.
I come, Greymalkin!
Had it cold? Anon.
Fair is foul and bad.
I no longer have the features I made, but I managed to find the original location recording. That was what you've just heard. It was well used. I was commissioned by the BBC World Service to make a 15-minute documentary about the play, but Good Morning Scotland took a 4-minute piece, the Arts Report on Radio Canada took 3 minutes, double their usual, and unexpected stations like Deutsche Welle also took features. I think I put in about 48 hours almost without sleep over that story. I said that most of my work was in radio, but occasionally I had to do TV. Remember the dead swan found in the harbour at Celtic? Well, a camera crew had been sent down from Dundee, but the local reporter from there was on another job. I had been sent from Edinburgh to cover the story for radio, and found myself doing this. So far, only the swan found here at Celtic was found to have the deadly form of bird flu. Although a number of dead birds have been found and sent to the testing centre, none were proved positive.
As of this moment, we've got no positive results. All results are negative. The results of birds, samples that were taken from birds yesterday, clearly it's too soon to have any results for these. But we will continue to pick up birds within this area. Now we've taken over the responsibility for that.
But since then, other negative tests have been reported. Even so, the executive believes that with the public out in the countryside this weekend, more birds may be found. The dead birds are believed to come from some 22 sites around Scotland, but the main focus of attention inevitably turns to places like here at Loch Leven or further north at Montrose Basin, because that is where the greatest concentration of wild birds, including geese, swans and ducks, are to be found.
We have some 70 staff working from this area, in addition to the normal staff that we have here. These staff that have come in to date have been veterinary staff, administrative staff, and are principally staff that have a prior brief.
The imposition of a 1,000-square-mile wild bird risk zone has worried many people who keep birds, even those in otherwise safe areas. In particular, those who keep racing pigeons are worried because their season is just about to begin.
The advice will be to keep the pigeons in the lofts should an outbreak happen in this area. And we're not sure as yet as whether we're just about to start the racing season, so we're not sure if that's going to go ahead or not now.
Despite the encouraging news from the testing centres, they plan to hold their breath for a little longer.
For about 10 years I was commissioned to make documentaries for BBC Radio Scotland, the World Service, Radio 5 Live and Radio Canada. Radio 5 Live used to buy a whole week of my time to make 15 minutes for a programme hosted by this lady. Her name is Sybil Ruscoe. Just as an aside, I think she's back in local radio, but is using her profile to raise money for prostate cancer research. They had me travel the length and breadth of the UK. There was a feature about Northern Ireland after the Troubles, one about slate quarrying in North Wales. I think the most bizarre week came when we were recording features in advance. So they flew me down to Exeter to gather material for a piece on Devon and Cornwall police. Then flew me back up to Edinburgh with enough time to change clothes before heading up to Orkney to gather interviews about the air ambulance service. When I arrived, I got a message saying that they had decided not to take part. Never knew why, but the BBC told me, "We paid for the flights, the car and the hotel. Just take a few days to yourself." Would never happen now. Oh, and by the way, I also edited the technology page for the Scotsman through much of this time. Curiously, I was in Maggie's a couple of weeks ago and was chatting to a woman sitting at the table out in the garden. Turns out she remembered me from my work on the newspaper, but had completely forgotten what I'd done at the Beeb. However, around the turn of the century, things began to change dramatically. Budgets were being slashed in every form of media. First to go was the column in the Scotsman. Then Radio Canada, the World Service, Radio 5 Live, and finally Radio Scotland, with the exception for a time of the newsroom, and even here the impact was drastic. There are now more people employed in online news than in radio news. Reporters today have to service TV, radio, online, and there are fewer of them to do it. Finally, the older, more expensive people like me were shown the door, sometimes with little warning. I was lucky in some respects. Some of us had already got together with the idea of forming an independent production company, which we called Bitweb TV. Oh, don't ask. But almost the day I left the BBC for almost the last time, we found we had clients. The work we did for Edinburgh Chamber won them an award for the most innovative chamber in the UK, not just Scotland. We worked with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, making videos about best practice, so members could learn from each other. And we got involved with Scotland's first online newspaper, the Caledonian Mercury. I think we made about 60 videos for them. Didn't make money from it, but the profile was good and some were great fun to make.
There was a stiff breeze blowing as the yachts lined up in Granton Harbour, ready for the weekend's racing. But these were but mild conditions compared with the storms that all but destroyed these boats earlier in the week. The race officers headed out into the Firth of Forth to test the wind and the waves, and concluded at first that both were too strong for competition, at least at the start of the day.
We had a huge amount of wind. The forecast was very strong winds. We had really exciting time out there. After we did eventually get out, we were delayed by 2 hours, but we had some fantastic racing while we were out there, and all of the classes got racing in sunny weather and strong winds. What's not to like? dozens of sailing clubs on the river. The Fourth Yacht Clubs Association website will tell you all about all of those. And the Edinburgh is a large city. It's got a fantastic waterfront capability, and you know, we've been sailing within, it takes 20 minutes to drive to the city centre to this venue.
Port Edgar Yacht Club also joined in when racing eventually took place in a melee of sails and spray. There's a popular misconception that sailing is for the elite, but the motto of the 4th Corinthian Club is affordable sailing for all.
Oh, it's yeah, there's rich guys that do it. I suspect we get more fun out of it because everything we do on the boats that we've struggled to buy in most cases is, how would you put it, it's cherished. You know, if you spend a lot of money and the stuff on a boat's not cheap, if you spend a lot of money on something, you look after it because you couldn't afford to replace it. I mean, this boat that we're sitting on here is a joint ownership between Ed North and myself. We couldn't do it ourselves, you know, singularly. We have to, the partnership allows us to have a reasonable boat at a reasonable cost. What's
really important to understand is that you can buy a boat now for £4,000 or £5,000. I mean, there's a group of boats out there that are racing the 707s, which you're buying second-hand for about £5,000 now for a complete boat that you can go racing in. That's the cost of a sort of a medium-sized second-hand car. And so I think it's pretty much within the realms of most people's budgets. It is affordable sailing for all because we're very much a do-it-yourself club. We don't employ anyone unless we have to. It's something that, you know, requires a professional, or there are certain skills that we don't have. We do it is to keep costs down so that people can go sailing, and nobody who turns up at the Corinthian Club, whether they want to join or just want to sail, will be turned away.
The sponsors of the Edinburgh Regatta insist that their involvement comes mainly from their own love of the sport.
My whole family's sailed since we've all been at a very young age, up in Fintorn, up in the north of Scotland. It's just a great sport to be involved with. You get outdoors, you're not stuck inside, you get to meet great people. As a brand, and as with Ben Romerick, we want to try and target events where you have people who like doing outdoor events and actually like being slightly different and not just conforming to the norm that everybody else would be conforming to.
Ben Romerick have been terrific in terms of attracting people in with a little bit of colour, a little bit of atmosphere, I suppose, to the event, and also helping us out with the advertising.
Strengthening winds and shortening days mean that this year's sailing season is all but over, but there are good memories to look back on over the long winter nights.
There were a number of clients who were a pleasure to work with. The Famous Grouse was one of those. We made about 20 videos for them, some of them for use in-house, others to celebrate an achievement, like this one.
228 bottles of the famous grouse. Thank you, Neil. Now,
the current Guinness World Records title stands at 184 litres and is held by Jack Daniels. I can now confirm that with 228 litres, this is officially the largest bottle of whiskey. It therefore gives me great pleasure to officially recognise a new Guinness World Records title.
The last video produced was for Roslyn Chapel. Primary schools in Midlothian were no longer coming to visit thanks to budget cuts, so they wanted some education material made for the schools to use. One of their regulars was a man called Alistair Strachan, who made a living dressing up in historical military outfits and explaining how they were used. They wanted him to talk about those who took part in the Battle of Roslyn in the early 14th century. The end product's about 10 minutes long, so this is just the opening.
I wonder what life was like for a night back in 1303.
Don't worry, lad. I'm not a ghost. I'm here to answer your question. I'm going to take you down to Roslyn Glen and we'll show you how we prepared the medieval knight for battle. So here we are in 1303. We're at Roslyn Glen, just below the castle, and you are now my squire. And it is your job to prepare me for battle, but before we do, we're going to show you what a squire would wear in a battle situation. So this is the padded jack, or the gambeson. It is a basic layer of protection for a knight. For you, it is your only protection. I'm going to turn you around. And the ridges at the back are packed full of material, and the idea is that will cushion a blow. For example, if I was to punch you in the kidneys, that will cushion the blow. However, it's 1303, we don't go around pushing each other in the kidneys. We are not barbarians. We would use something like this. And if I take that across, it will cushion the blow. However, the blade will cut through the material, it will then cut through you, and you won't enjoy the experience. And that is the origin of the expression, to get the stuffing knocked out of you, because the material will come flying out as I hit you.
One of the reasons I don't have much archive from the early days has to do with a combination of factors, including some being wiped when an external hard drive failed. But a lot of it is to do with the fact that the media are by definition ephemeral. It's largely a do it and forget it kind of business. And it has to do with how we made programmes through the years. And I've lived through a revolution in production, from film and audio tape to videotape, then to cassettes and digital audio tape, for example, digital editing, satellite broadcasting, and finally now everything is digital. Even some of the studios that you think look real, well, basically aren't. I've heard folks say that the media are some kind of new creation, but they're not. You could say they go back to cave painting, and then the printing press, and radio, television, and now a lot of young folk don't even know what a TV is. It's moving faster all the time. Scotland used to have a strong newspaper industry, but how many of these are actually owned here in Scotland? Just one, the Press and Journal in Aberdeen, except it's owned by DC Thomson in Dundee. What about the broadcast media? Of these, only STV is actually owned and managed from here. The BBC is, well, the BBC, the National Public Sector Broadcaster, and the two radio stations are part of the Bauer Radio Group. Now, there has been a proliferation of very local radio stations. East Coast Radio is based in Haddington in East Lothian, Pulse is in East Renfrewshire, Nevis Radio in Argyll, all community run. And thanks to the internet, we now have podcasting, which started thanks to the iPod, first launched 20 years ago. It's something that can be done from home with very little special equipment. This is my own setup, for example. I was curious to see if there were podcasts about prostate cancer, And in the US there are lots. But here I found only 2, neither of which seems to be that active. Back in 2016 I set up the Porty podcast because so much was happening in Portobello Joppa, starting with the first ever urban community buyout of a redundant church, now the Belfield Centre. Things like open water swimming have exploded during lockdown, with over 5,000 people now actively involved. And turning full circle, we've just learned in the last few days that Portobello Town Hall is now fully in local control. What then of the future? Does the BBC have one? Is Channel 4's metal mascot about to walk into history? What I'm pretty sure it won't be is this. Finally, I don't know how any of you found out about our shared disease, but my life changed on the 26th of June, 2017.
There are no slides for this final part of the presentation, because this is the day that my life changed completely. You see, my hip broke, or rather the neck of the femur broke. I wasn't doing anything, just sitting in the bed when my wife said, "Come and have a look at this interesting bird in the garden." And I found I couldn't get up without considerable pain. We had to wait 7 hours for an ambulance. It wasn't a life-threatening emergency. And when we got to the Royal Infirmary, I had to wait 3 hours on a trolley before being seen by a doctor, a very tired-looking doctor. Because by then the pain was not just in the hip, but shooting down my legs, he concluded I had sciatica, but he had me admitted for observation. The consultant and physio agreed, after 5 days of very little observation. When I was discharged, the hospital called for a taxi but refused to get a porter or wheelchair, as they said I should be able to walk. My wife managed to find a wheelchair, and the taxi driver turned out to be much more helpful than the medics, as he had been a professional footballer and had broken assorted bones while playing the game. There then followed 6 weeks when we were left pretty much on our own. 6 weeks in which I lost around 20 kilos. Okay, we had some help in the form of crutches and other aids, but very little else other than that from friends and neighbours. Eventually my GP agreed it had to be investigated, and this time at the Leith Community Health Centre, which had an X-ray facility, they confirmed that yes, indeed, I had a broken hip. And yeah, within minutes we were on our way back to the Royal Infirmary, this time straight into a surgical ward. When the operation was finished and the bones were sent off to find out why they had broken, well, that was when we learned that I had advanced prostate cancer. I was in there for another 17 days while I was put through assorted big medical machines. That's how we learned that it had spread to more than just my hip. It's also in my spine, for instance. We also discovered that the magic painkiller oxycodone, which allowed other patients to effectively tap dance their way out of the ward after just a few hours, had very little effect on me, despite their dramatically increasing the dose. They finally had to put me on a morphine drip, which did help. Anyway, I was finally released back into the wild, and one of the first things we did was come to Maggie's. You see, the Royal hadn't told us anything about what having this cancer actually meant, or what treatments might be available. Izzy at Maggie's provided all of that and took away all of the stress and the fear that had been building up in both of us. And then we saw the consultant who prescribed first radiotherapy, then chemo, and finally hormone therapy. I've just had the last dose of that. And I'm sure that you who've been through Ward 1 will know just how excellent the care is in there. So, the cancer is under control, but then came this little virus called COVID. We know how we caught it. A woman sneezed violently over my wife while on a bus, although Penny got into a shower the moment she got back. 3 or 4 days later, the symptoms began. The loss of taste and smell and the rest, though thankfully it was a mild dose. What hasn't been so mild is what we now call long COVID. The sudden onset of exhaustion, of breathlessness, brain fog and memory problems. And for me, if that coincides with the side effects of the hormone injections, in particular the very heavy sweats, it becomes very debilitating. So much so that I'm now back at Maggie's because it's taken a toll on my mental health as well as my physical health. I've even had to hand the podcast over to someone else for a while as I couldn't cope anymore. It's also why I decided to record this presentation, as I really wasn't sure if I could manage to deliver it without the long COVID bringing it to a shuddering halt. It also allowed me to record it in bits while I was feeling okay and then editing the bits together. So I like to think I've had an interesting life, but I really could have done without this last bit.